Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to assignment number 16 of Salem's Lot. We only have 3 assignments left, so things are really coming to a conclusion now. We are definitely in the climax of our novel. As you saw yesterday, Father Callahan was forced to drink Barlow's blood, which means that he is now basically a half pyre himself. How does he become a full vampire? If we go by what we learned in Dracula, how does somebody who has been forced to drink somebody's blood become a full vampire? Well, there's 2 ways, right? One, he dies. And that's going to happen to him at some point, right? Because he's not undead. So as he ages and then he dies, he will turn into a full vampire, right? The other way, of course, is if he drinks human blood, and then he will become a full vampire. How can it be stopped so that neither of those things happen? The only way that would be is if Barlow is taken care of and if he is destroyed. And if that happens, then Callahan can still be okay. The irony, of course, is that Callahan is a Catholic priest. And that is, of course, why Barlow made him drink his blood, so it would like kind of taint him and make it so that he can never be in God's grace again. He can certainly never go to heaven. He can't even communicate with God now. He can't touch anything godly because he's a half pyre. He can have nothing to do with the Catholic Church. Now, of course, if we think about Dracula, who did Count Dracula forced to drink his blood also and made that person a half pyre? Of course, the answer would be Mina. How do we know that she was that half pyre? Remember, they put the wafer, the host, on her head, and it burned into her head, and it left that scar forever. And because they killed Dracula at the end, they destroyed him. She turned back away. You know, she got her soul back, and she was okay. So let's see if they can kill Barlow. Then Callahan can come back as well. Let's wait and see what happens. As always, you know that this is a very mature novel, so make sure that there's no little kids in the area listening to it. They cannot hear it because it's just too mature for them, of course. You please enjoy it. Now, where are we today for assignment number 16? And it's 16 questions. Specifically, you'll find it in part 3, The Deserted Village, chapter 14, The Lot 4-3, and now we are all the way down to part 21. So again, we're in part 3, The Deserted Village, chapter 14, The Lot 4-3, and we are down in part 21. Let's go. 21. Ann Norton got out of her car without bothering to take the keys and began to walk across the hospital parking lot toward the bright lights of the lobby. Overhead clouds had blotted out the stars, and soon it would begin to rain. She didn't look up to see the clouds. She walked stolidly, looking straight in front of her. She was a very different-looking woman from the lady Ben Mears had met on that first evening Susan had invited him to take dinner with her family. That lady had been medium tall, dressed in a green wool dress that did not scream of money but spoke of material comfort. That lady had not been beautiful, but she had been well-groomed and pleasant to look at. Her graying hair had been permed not long since. This woman wore only carpet slippers on her feet. Her legs were bare, and with no support hose to mask them, the varicose veins bulged prominently. Although not as prominently as before, some of the pressure had been taken off them. She was wearing a ragged yellow dressing gown over her negligee. Her hair was blown in errant cheeks by the rising wind. Her face was pallid, and heavy brown circles lay beneath her eyes. She had told Susan, had warned her about that man Mears and his friends, had warned her about the man who had murdered her. Matt Burke had put him up to it. They had been in cahoots. Oh yes, she knew. He had told her. She had been sick all day, sick and sleepy, nearly unable to get out of bed. And when she had fallen into a heavy slumber after noon while her husband was off answering questions for a silly missing persons report, he had come to her in a dream. His face was handsome and commanding and arrogant and compelling. His nose was hawk-like, his hair swept back from his brow, and his heavy, fascinating mouth masked strangely exciting white teeth that showed when he smiled. And his eyes, they were red and hypnotic. When he looked at you with those eyes, you could not look away. And you didn't want to. Now, clearly, she's talking about Barlow. And look at the way he's being described. It could almost be the description of Count Dracula himself. He had told her everything and what she must do, and how she could be with her daughter when it was done, and with so many others, and with him. Despite Susan, it was him she wanted to please. So he would give her the thing she craved and needed, the touch, the penetration. Her husband's 38 was in her pocket. She entered the lobby and looked toward the reception desk. If anyone tried to stop her, she would take care of them. Not by shooting, no. No shot must be fired until she was in Burke's room. He had told her so. If they got to her and stopped her before she had done the job, he would not come to her to give her burning kisses at night. There was a young girl at the desk in a white cap and uniform, working a crossword in the soft glow of the lamp over her main console. An orderly was just going down the hall, his back to them. The duty nurse looked up with a trained smile when she heard Anne's footsteps, but it faded when she saw the hollow-eyed woman who was approaching her in night clothes. Her eyes were blank yet oddly shiny, as if she were a wind-up toy someone had set in motion. A patient, perhaps, who had gone wandering. Ma'am, if you? Anne Norton drew the .38 from the pocket of her wrapper like some creaky gunslinger from beyond time. She pointed at the duty nurse's head and told her, "Turn around." The nurse's mouth worked silently. She drew in a breath with a convulsive heave. "Don't scream. I'll kill you if you do." The air wheezed out. The nurse had gotten very pale. "Turn around now." The nurse got up and slowly turned around. Anne Norton reversed the .38 and prepared to bring the butt down on the nurse's head with all the strength she had. At that precise moment, her feet were kicked out from under her. 22. The gun went flying. The woman in the ragged yellow dressing gown did not scream, but began to make a high whining noise in her throat, almost keening. She scrambled after it like a crab, and the man who was behind her, looking bewildered and frightened, also darted after it. When he saw that she would get to it first, he kicked it across the lobby rug. "Hey," he yelled. "Hey, help!" Anne Norton looked over her shoulder and hissed at him, her face pulled into a cheated scrawl of hate, and then scrambled after the gun again. The orderly had come back on the run. He looked at the scene with blank amazement for a moment and then picked up the gun that lay almost at his feet. "For Christ's sake," he said, "this thing is loaded." She attacked him. Her hand ticked into claws, pinwheeled across his face, dragging red stripes across the surprised orderly's forehead and right cheek. He held the gun up out of her reach. Still keening, she clawed for it. The bewildered man came up from behind and grabbed her. He would say later that it was like grabbing a bag of snakes. The body beneath the dressing gown was hot and repulsive, every muscle twitching and writhing. As she struggled to get free, the orderly popped her one flush on the jaw. Her eyes rolled up to the whites and she collapsed. The orderly and the bewildered man looked at each other. The nurse at the reception desk was screaming. Her hands were clapped to her mouth, giving the screams a unique foghorn effect. "What kind of hospital do you people run here anyhow?" the bewildered man asked. "Christ if I know," the orderly said. "What the hell happened?" "I was just coming in to visit my sister. She had a baby, and this kid walks up to me and says a woman just went in with a gun, and—" "What kid?" The bewildered man who had come to visit his sister looked around. The lobby was filling with people, but all of them were above drinking age. "I don't see him now, but he was here. That gun loaded?" "It sure is," the orderly said. What kind of hospital do you people run here anyhow?" the bewildered man asked again. 23. They had seen two nurses run past the door toward the elevators and heard a vague shout down the stairwell. Ben glanced at Jimmy, and Jimmy shrugged imperceptibly. Matt was dozing with his mouth open. Ben closed the door and turned off the lights. Jimmy crouched by the foot of Matt's bed, and when they heard footsteps hesitate outside the door, Ben stood beside it, ready. When it opened and a head poked through, he grabbed it in a half Nelson and jammed the cross he held it in the other hand into the face. "Let me go!" A hand reached up and beat futilely at his chest. A moment later, the overhead light went on. Matt was sitting up in bed, blinking at Mark Petrie, who was struggling in Ben's arms. Jimmy came out of his crouch and ran across the room. He seemed almost ready to embrace the boy when he hesitated. "Lift your chin." Mark did, showing all three of them his unmarked neck. Jimmy relaxed. "Boy, I've never been so glad to see anyone in my life. Where's the father?" "Don't know," Mark said somberly. "Barlow caught me. Killed my folks. They're dead. My folks are dead." He beat their heads together. "He killed my folks. Then he had me, and he said to Father Callahan that he would let go of me if Father Callahan would promise to throw away his cross. He promised. I ran. But before I ran, I spit on him. And I'm gonna kill him." He swayed in the doorway. There were bramble marks on his forehead and cheeks. He had run through the forest along the path where Danny Glick and his brother had come to grief so long before. His pants were wet to the knees from his flight through Taggart Stream. He had hitched a ride, but couldn't remember who he had hitched it with. The radio had been playing. He remembered that. Ben's tongue was frozen. He didn't know what to say. "You poor boy," Matt said softly. "You poor, brave boy." Mark's face began to break up. His eyes closed, his mouth twisted and strained. My mother." He staggered blindly, and Ben caught him in his arms and folded him, rocked him as the tears came and raged against his shirt. 24. Father Donald Callan had no idea how long he walked in the dark. He stumbled back toward the downtown area along Joyner Avenue, never heeding his car, which he had left parked in the Petrie's driveway. Sometimes he wandered in the middle of the road, and sometimes he staggered along the sidewalk. Once a car bore down on him, its headlights great shining circles. Its horn began to blare, and it swerved at the last instant, tires screaming on the pavement. Once he fell in the ditch. As he approached the yellow blinking light, it began to rain. There was no one on the streets to mark his passage. Salem's lot had battened down for the night, even tighter than usual. The diner was empty, and in Spencer's, Miss Coogan was sitting by her cash register and reading a confession magazine off the rack in the frosty glow of the overhead fluorescence. Outside, under the lighted sign showing the blue dog in mid-flight, a red neon sign said, "Bus." They were afraid, he supposed. They had every reason to be. Some inner part of themselves had absorbed the danger, and tonight doors were locked in the lot that had not been locked in years, if ever. He was on the streets alone, and he had nothing to fear. It was funny. He laughed aloud, and the sound of it was like wild lunatic sobbing. No vampire would touch him. Others, perhaps, but not him. The master had marked him, and he would walk free until the master claimed his own. St. Andrew's loomed above him. He hesitated, then walked up the path. He would pray. He'd pray all night if necessary. Not to the new God, the God of ghettos and social conscience and free lunches, but the old God who had proclaimed through Moses not to suffer, a witch to live, and who had given it unto his own son to raise from the dead. A second chance. God, all my life for penance. Only a second chance. He stumbled up the wide steps, his gown muddy and bedraggled, his mouth smeared with Barlow's blood. At the top, he paused a moment, then he reached for the handle of the middle door. As he touched it, there was a blue flash of light, and he was thrown backward. Pain lanced his back, then his head, then his chest and the stomach and shins as he fell head over heels down the granite steps to the walk. He lay trembling in the rain, his hand afire. He lifted it before his eyes. It was burned. Unclean, he muttered. Unclean, unclean. Oh, God, so unclean. He began to shiver. He slid his arms around his shoulders and shivered in the rain, and the church loomed behind him, its doors shut against him. 25. Mark Petrie sat on Matt's bed in exactly the spot Ben had occupied when Ben and Jimmy had come in. Mark had dried his tears with his shirt sleeve, and although his eyes were puffy and bloodshot, he seemed to have himself in control. "You know, don't you," Matt asked him, "that Salem's lot is in a desperate situation?" Mark nodded. "Even now, his undead are crawling all over it," Matt said somberly, "taking others to themselves. They won't get them all, not tonight, but there is dreadful work ahead of you tomorrow." "Matt, I want to get some sleep," Jimmy said. "We'll be here, don't worry. You don't look good. This has been a horrible strain on you." "My town is disintegrating once before my eyes, and you want me to sleep?" His eyes, seemingly tireless, flashed out of his haggard face. Jimmy said stubbornly, "If you don't want to be around for the finish, you better save something back. If you want to be around for the finish, you better save something back. I'm telling you that as your physician, God damn it." "All right, in a minute," he looked at all of them. "Tomorrow, the three of you must go back to Mark's house. You're going to make steaks, a great many of them." The meaning sank home to them. "How many?" Ben asked softly. "I will say you'll need 300 at least. I advise you to make 500. "That's impossible," Jimmy said flatly. "There can't be that many of them." "The undead are thirsty," Matt said simply. "It's best to be prepared. You will go together. You dare not split up, even in the daytime. It'll be like a scavenger hunt. You must start at one end of town and work toward the other." "We'll never be able to find them all," Ben objected. "Not even if we could start at first light and work through until dark." "You've got to do your best, Ben. People may begin to believe you. Some will help if you show them the truth of what you say. And when dark comes again, much of his work will be undone." He sighed. "We have to assume that Father Callahan is lost to us. That's bad, but you must press on regardless. You'll have to be careful, all of you. Be ready to lie. If you're locked up, that will serve its purpose well. And if you haven't considered it, you might do well to consider it now. There is every possibility that some of us or all of us may live and triumph only to stand trial for murder." He looked at each of them in the face. What he saw there must have satisfied him because he turned his attention wholly to Mark again. "You know what the most important job is, don't you?" "Yes," Mark said. "Barlow has to be killed." Matt smiled a trifle thinly. That's putting the cart before the horse, I'm afraid. First, we have to find him." He looked closely at Mark. "Did you see anything tonight? Hear anything? Smell anything? Touch anything that might help us locate him? Think carefully before you answer. You know better than any of us how important it is." Mark thought. Ben had never seen anyone take a command quite so literally. He lowered his chin into the palm of his hands and shut his eyes. He seemed to be quite deliberately going over every nuance of the night's encounter. At last he opened his eyes, looked around at them briefly, and shook his head. Nothing. Matt's face fell, but he did not give up. A leaf clinging to his coat, maybe? A cattail in his pants cuff? Dirt on his shoes? Any loose thread that he is allowed to dangle? He smote the bed helplessly. Jesus Christ almighty, is he seamless like an egg? Mark's eyes suddenly widened. "What?" Matt said. He grasped the boy's elbow. "What is it? What have you thought of?" "Blue chalk," Mark said. He had one arm hooked around my neck like this, and I could see his hand. He had long white fingers, and there were smears of blue chalk on two of them, just little ones. "Blue chalk," Matt said thoughtfully. "A school," Ben said. "It must be." "Not the high school," Matt said. "All our supplies come from Dennison and Company in Portland. They supply only white and yellow. I've had it under my fingernails and on my coats for years." "Art classes?" Ben asked. "No, only graphic arts in the high school. They use inks, not chalk." "Mark, are you sure it was?" Chalk, he said, nodding. I believe some of the science teachers use colored chalk, but where's there to hide at the high school? You saw it all on one level, all enclosed in glass. People are in and out of the supply closets all day. That is also true of the furnace room. Backstage, Matt shrugged. It's dark enough. But if Mrs. Roden takes over the clay class for me, I'm sorry, the class, sorry. But if Mrs. Roden takes over the class play for me, the students call her Miss Rodan after a quaint Japanese science fiction film, that area would be used a great deal. It would be a horrible risk for him. What about the grammar schools, Jimmy asked? They must teach drawing in the lower grades, and I bet $100 that colored chalk is one of the things they keep on hand. Matt said, the Stanley Street Elementary School is built with the same bond money as the high school. It is also modernistic, filled to capacity, and built on one level. Many glass windows to let in the sun. Not the kind of building our target would want to frequent at all. They're like old buildings, full of tradition, dark, dingy, like the Brock Street School, Mark said. Yes, Matt looked at Ben. The Brock Street School is a wooden frame building, 3 stories in a basement, built at about the same time as the Marston House. There was much talk in the town when the school bond issue was up for a vote that the school was a fire hazard. It was one reason our bond issue passed. There had been a schoolhouse fire in New Hampshire 2 or 3 years before. I remember, Jimmy murmured. In Cobb's Ferry, wasn't it? Yes, 3 children were burned to death. Is the Brock Street School still used? Ben asked. Only the first floor, grades 1 through 4. The entire building is due to be phased out in 2 years when they put the addition on the Stanley Street School. Is there a place for Barlow to hide? I suppose so, Matt said, but he sounded reluctant. The second and third floors are full of empty classrooms. The windows have been boarded over because so many children threw stones at them. That's it then, Ben said. It must be. It sounds good, Matt admitted, and he looked very tired indeed now, but it seemed too simple, too transparent. Blue chalk, Jimmy murmured. His eyes were far away. I don't know, Matt said, sounding distracted. I just don't know. Jimmy opened his black bag and brought out a small bottle of pills. 2 of these with water, he said. Right now. No, there's too much to go over. There's too much for us to risk losing you, Ben said firmly. If Father Callahan is gone, you're the most important of all of us now. Do as he says. Mark brought a glass of water from the bathroom, and Matt gave in with some bad grace. It was 10:15. Silence fell on the room. Ben thought that Matt looked fearfully old, fearfully used. His white hair seemed thinner, drier, and a lifetime of care seemed to have stamped itself on his face in a matter of days. In a way, Ben thought, it was fitting that when trouble finally came to him, great trouble, it should come in this dreamlike, darkly fantastical form. A lifetime's existence had prepared him to deal in symbolic evils that sprang to light under the reading lamp and disappeared at dawn. I'm worried about him, Jimmy said softly. I thought the attack was mild, Ben said. Not really a heart attack at all. It was a mild occlusion, but the next one won't be mild. It'll be major. This business is going to kill him if it doesn't end quickly. He took his mad hand and fingered the pulse gently, with love. That, he said, would be a tragedy. They waited around the bedside, sleeping and watching by turns. He slept the night away, and Barlow did not put in an appearance. He had business elsewhere. 26. Miss Coogan was reading a story called I Tried to Strangle Our Baby in Real Life Confessions when the door opened and her first customer of the evening came in. She had never seen things so slow. Ruthie Crockett and her friends hadn't even been in for a soda at the fountain, not that she missed that crowd. And Loretta Starcher hadn't stopped in for the New York Times. It was still under the counter, neatly folded. Loretta was the only person in Jerusalem's lot who bought the Times. She pronounced it that way, in italics, regularly. And the next day she would put it out in the reading room. Mr. Labrie hadn't come back from his supper either, although there was nothing unusual about that. Mr. Labrie was a widower with a big house out on Schoolyard Hill near the Griffins, and Miss Coogan knew perfectly well that he didn't go home for his supper. He went out to Dell's and ate hamburgers and drank beer. If he wasn't back by 11, and it was 11:15 now, she would get the key out of the cash drawer and lock up herself. Wouldn't be the first time either. But they would all be in a pretty pickle if someone came in needing medicine badly. She sometimes missed the after-movie rush that had always come about this time before they had demolished the old Nordica across the street. People wanting ice cream sodas and fraps and malteds, dates holding hands and talking about homework assignments. It had been hard, but it had been wholesome too. Those children hadn't been like Ruthie Crockett and her crowd, sniggering and flaunting their busts and wearing jeans tight enough to show the lines of their panties, if they were wearing any. The reality of her feelings for those bygone patrons, although she had forgotten it, had irritated her just as much, was fogged by nostalgia, and she looked up eagerly when the door opened, as if it might be a member of the class of '64 and his girl, ready for a chocolate fudge sundae with extra nuts. But it was a man, a grown-up man, someone she knew but could not place. As he carried his suitcase down the counter, something in his walk or the motion of his head identified him for her. Father Callahan, she said, unable to keep the surprise out of her voice. She had never seen him without his priest suit on. He was wearing plain dark slacks and a blue chambray shirt like a common mill worker. She was suddenly frightened. The clothes he wore were clean and his hair was neatly combed, but there was something in his face. Something. She suddenly remembered the day 20 years ago when she had come from the hospital where her mother had died of a sudden stroke, what the old-timers called a shock. When she had told her brother, he had looked something like Father Callahan did now. His face had a haggard Dunes look, and his eyes were blank and stunned. There was a burned-out look in them that made her uncomfortable, and the skin around his mouth looked red and irritated, as if he had overshaved or rubbed it for a long period of time with a washcloth, trying to get rid of a bad stain. "I want to buy a bus ticket," he said. That's it, she thought. Poor man. Someone's died and he just got the call down at the directory or whatever they call it. Certainly, she said. Where? What's the first bus? To where? Anywhere, he said, throwing her theory into shambles. Well, I don't. Let me see. She fumbled at the schedule and looked at it, flustered. There's a bus at 11:10 that comes with Portland, Boston, Hartford, and New York. That's one, he said. That one, he said. How much? For how long? I mean, how far? She was thoroughly flustered now. All the way, he said hollowly and smiled. She had never seen such a dreadful smile on a human face, and she flinched from it. If he touches me, she thought, scream blue murder. That would be to New York City, she said, $29.75. He dug his wallet out of his back pocket with some difficulty, and she saw that his right hand was bandaged. He put a 20 and 2 ones before her, and she knocked a whole pile of blank tickets onto the floor, taking one off the top of the stack. When she finished picking them up, he had added 5 more ones in a pile of change. She wrote the ticket as fast as she could, but nothing would have been fast enough. She could feel his dead gaze on her. She stamped it and pushed it across the counter so she wouldn't have to touch his hand. You'll have to wait outside, Father Callahan. I've got to close in about 5 minutes. She scraped the bills and change into the cash drawer blindly, making no attempt to count it. That's fine, he said. He stuck the ticket into his breast pocket. Without looking at her, he said, and the Lord set a mark upon Cain, that whoever found him should not kill him. And Cain went out from the face of the Lord and dwelt as a fugitive on the earth at the east side of Eden. That's scripture, Miss Cooten. The hardest scripture in the Bible. Is that so? She said. I'm afraid you'll have to go outside, Father Callahan. Mr. LeBouillet is just in back a minute, and he doesn't like me to. Of course, he said, and turned to go. He stopped and looked at her. She flinched before those wooden eyes. You live in Falmouth, don't you, Miss Coogan? Yes. Have your own car? Yes, of course. I really have to ask you for the wait for the bus outside. Drive home quickly tonight, Miss Coogan. Lock all your car doors and don't stop for anybody. Anybody. Don't even stop if it's someone you know. I never pick up hitchhikers, Miss Coogan said righteously. And when you get home, stay away from Jerusalem's lot, he went on. He was looking at her fixedly. Things have gone bad in the lot now. She said faintly, I don't know what you're talking about, but you'll have to wait for the bus outside. Yes, all right. He went out. She became suddenly aware of how quiet the drugstore was, how utterly quiet. Could it be that no one had come in since it got dark except Father Callahan? It was. No one at all. Things had gone bad in the lot now. She began to go around and turn off the lights. Excellent place for us to stop. We are now at part 27, so you're going to pick it up again in part 3, The Deserted Village, chapter 14, the lot 4-3, down to number 27. So again, you're in part 3, The Deserted Village, chapter 14, the lot 4-3, and then you're going to go down to part 27. Enjoy the rest of this assignment, everybody. We will talk more tomorrow.